Hi, welcome back. This is the professor video that accompanies the Confucianism PowerPoint. So let's head on over right now. All right, so I would have to say that the Smith book, your Smith textbook, which is The World's Religions, has an excellent chapter on Confucianism, where it clearly explains the five virtues, gives different examples, and also gives a pretty detailed biography of who Confucius is. So I'm going to expect you to know that information. All right, this PowerPoint was only 4 slides long, but I'm going to expect you to have read that chapter in the Smith book and to know in detail with examples what those 5 virtues are. Okay? All right. So Confucianism is a philosophy that developed in 6th century BCE. The 6th century BCE is actually a curious age because many different religions actually started or at least underwent changes at that point. And some people actually call it the axial age because Hinduism started then, Hinduism surfaced out of Vedism then, Buddhism starts then, Taoism actually starts in the 6th century, Confucianism starts then, the Zoroastrianism, which is a Persian religion. In Judaism, the temple fell and the religion was basically destroyed and they had to kind of redo it. And then in Greek philosophy, a lot of things happened, kind of like a resurgence in Greek philosophy happened around between the 6th and the 4th century. So it's kind of an interesting time period. Anyway, Confucianism is also unusual because if you remember back to the What is Religion PowerPoint, religion has to have a sacred other, right? A sacred sense of reality or some sort of ultimate reality, whether it's nirvana or Atman Brahman or a Godhead or Jesus, right? Confucianism is unusual because it's more of a philosophy rather than a religion, but it had taken kind of a life of its own because it became part of like the state philosophy in China for centuries upon centuries that it almost took on religious overtones, like mandatory overtones. Do you know what I mean? So some people call it a social code. Some people call it a religion. I think it's something of both, okay? Just because over the years, as it became entrenched in Chinese culture and actually even beyond China's borders into Korea and Japan, it took on more of a religious overtone. It's based on the belief that human beings are essentially good and that they engage in immoral behavior through lack of a strong moral standard. So it's really about discipline as opposed to calling on a Godhead to forgive them for sins or anything like that. There's nothing like that. It's fully your responsibility. And if you discipline yourself and you follow a set of rules in terms of respect towards one another or even towards yourself and adhere to an ethical code, you should be able to maintain, good moral behavior and good, participation within a whole society that also adheres to that same ethical code. There are rituals that encourage it. In fact, like even down to how you walk, how you bow, how you look, how you place your hands, that enables one to live a productive and tranquil life of peace, which then translates to a strong ethical family, which translates to a community and ultimately to a prosperous state. So it starts with the individual and then expands beyond that, okay? It was founded by Confucius or Kung-Fu-Tzu, which means Confucius. People kind of translated to that, or Master Kong, right? He lived between 551 and 479 BCE. He was a Chinese philosopher, what they call the spring and autumnal period. In Chinese history, they tend to look at their history in terms of these like quarter sections, and he was of the spring and autumnal period. Confucius is one of the greatest philosophers of the 100 schools of thought. He wasn't unique. He wasn't alone in terms of being one of the philosophers at that time, but he just kind of rose to the occasion, probably because of his analects, of the fact that many of his writings and teachings were written down, and so people had access to it. So he's the most influential philosopher in Chinese history, and basically his teachings became kind of state teachings after a certain point, because people started to adhere to them, and they actually make a lot of sense. And over 2,000 years, they became kind of entrenched as just part of the Chinese culture. He was born 551 in the village of Kufu, the state of Lu, which is in the Shandong province. You know, China's huge. He was the son of a military commander named Kang, and he was of noble descent. So he was literate, he was smart, he was educated. So keep in mind, not everyone was like that in China. His birth name was Kong Hui, but he would later be addressed as Master Kong, Kong Hu Zi, okay? His father died when he was 3 years old, which then, even though he was of noble birth, basically plummeted into a life of poverty. He attended schools and supported his mother, but she died when he was 23. But at this point, you know, he was schooled in various teachings and occupations. By this time, he was already married, had at least one son and maybe two daughters, and he had been provided with basic education, things like rituals, music, archery, charioteering, calligraphy, and mathematics. But as I said before, he was schooled in a variety of teachings and disciplines at that point. He ended up taking a job as a teacher for government work, and then he was also involved in the government at a local level, like a town magistrate. At one point, he served as the magistrate of his town under the administration, and he wasn't like a rising star, but he was entrenched. He understood governmental politics. He understood state authority. He understood being organized. And as he was a governor, there was all this governmental turmoil, and that probably led to him saying, hey, starts with the person, extends to the family, extends to the community, and then in that way we can have a prosperous and stable state. So it may have been all of these political turmoils when he was in the government that led him to say, yeah, I don't want that. You know what I mean? So he tried to teach this ruling class, with all of this political turmoil, that they could live happier, freer, more fulfilling lives, but by observing right conduct in accordance with a moral code. And that would lead to an effective and just rule in terms of government. But of course, like many people in the upper class, if it interferes with something that they do, then they just don't want to do it. So he left the city of Lu and then actually, attempted to basically implement his Confucian philosophy elsewhere. It's very simple. Human beings are innately good, good being defined as understanding the difference between right and wrong, and in being inclined to choose what is right. So there's a real stress in self-understanding. There's a real stress in the use of our brain. So you know how in the What is Religion PowerPoint I was saying, sometimes religion isn't like the best thing, because sometimes you'll just say, that's what the Bible says, or that's what my God says. And you don't question it, even though God gave you this brain to question and to discipline and to do things, to be an active participant in your own faith structure, right? Confucianism is like that. It puts a lot of stress on you understanding what is right and wrong. Use your brain, train yourself, be disciplined, and don't just follow along with the masses, but it starts with you and then expands from you. So the idea, it's almost like a very humanist idea where the belief structure begins with you. So, obviously there are other Confucian philosophers, and there's one named Mencius, actually. There's a story of a person coming across a young boy who had fallen into a well. And your first impulse is obviously to save the boy, either by saving him or running to find someone to help, even though one does not know the boy or his parents and might be risking one's own safety in trying to help him. Mencius said that is the perfect example of the Confucian code, right? Your instinct to do good. You're not good in that example if you ignore the child or if you just run off without, I don't care, right? And so that's what Confucius is saying. We all have an inherent desire to help that boy in the well, whether it's by getting help or by helping him himself. That is that individual key to goodness. That's the thing that we need to build up, extrapolate upon, and then extend towards the community. In the case where one did neither of those things, In other words, when one chooses wrong over right, it's probably due to an ignorance of what is right, because you don't have a sense of a moral code or standard of conduct. At that point, you need to be taught what is right, because you do not have a sense of what is right, if you just walked away from that boy. So you might have ignored the boy if you had an overly developed sense of self-interest. I don't want to do that. It interferes with my time, right? Which seems to be happening a lot nowadays, in today's world. I don't want to do it. You're infringing on my rights and what I want to do, as opposed to, why don't we help the greater good, or why don't we help our neighbor, right? There's a lot of that stuff going on. So if a person which educated in right action and a proper understanding of the world, they would choose right over wrong. And so that's why Confucius said, maybe a lot of us have an inherent right, understanding of right and wrong, which means to help one another. But he also said, maybe we need to have a strict code of ethics that we adhere to in order to maintain that middle way of life of peace and prosperity. Maybe some people do need to be taught, in other words, right? So this is where that theological aspect of Confucianism comes in, because this is when Confucianism is forced to kind of teach this way to people who don't have an inherent code of conduct, code of morality. So things like the concept of Qian, which is a heaven, should be understood in this case as something closer to the Tao, okay? Qian is a source and sustainer of all life, which creates the ordered world out of chaos. We need to recognize this kind of existence of this almost divine energy, Qian, as a constant flux of yin and yang, darkness and light, right? Wet and dry, male and female. So the yin and yang of the world, right? There's a dualistic sense that there's always two parts of it. We need to recognize this existence of Qian, this heavenly energy, as being a source of this ethical code, okay? So you can make sacrifices to various gods and things like that, but really it's the idea of, you can do all of these things in Confucianism. Yes, there's all these different ways to do it, to understand your relationship with the Qian, the heavenly energy, but really at the bottom line is everything is designed to check your self-importance, your self-interest, or your selfish thinking that you're more important than anyone else, okay? So the ethical code of conduct is designed so that you can look elsewhere at other people and their care. Now, this belief in the Qian is not enough to encourage right action, right? One also needs to control just our instincts to baser instincts, right? So he advocates a strict code of ethics that one should adhere to in order to maintain this middle way of life in peace and prosperity. And these are called the 5 constants and the 4 virtues. I list them right here, but at this point, I would go look at Smith and see how he defines these key concepts, because I expect you to know them. And in the video, the Confucianism video, it's also explained there. And examples are given and defined in the Novak book. So I have them listed here, but all the information that you need are in the Smith book, in that Confucian video, and also in the Novak book, where not only does it give examples of each of these concepts, but it also gives you an explanation of those concepts, okay? All of these are equally important, but they begin at the core with filial piety. Now, like I said, it always starts with the person and it spreads to the family. So Confucius said, it is in the family where filial piety begins, where you're encouraged to honor and respect your parents, and then observe a hierarchy of authority within your family, between elder and younger, between males and females, between parents and children. So a younger brother respects and defers to his older brother, and women do the same with men. So there's like a clear hierarchy within the family unit, and then that gets extended outside the family unit. All right. I am going to finish this up in the second video, which will be shorter than this one, but I do need to go over it like this slide right here. and the rest of this one.